Why medieval kings? Listen to a woman named Hilda of Whitby. Take a breath. Get comfortable tonight. We're unlocking a forgotten drawer in history's quiet cabinet. You might not know what's inside, but I promise it hums with stories. Stories about a time when abbeys stood taller than castles, and a woman's wisdom could ripple further than a king's decree. The wind off the northern sea still whispers her name, Hilda of Whitby. But hers is not the kind of story that kicks down doors or waves a sword. No, hers moves softly, patiently, like candlelight through cloister halls. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The path to Whitby Abbey isn't paved with grandeur. It's not Rome. It's not Canterbury. It's a cliff windblown and craggy, where seabirds outnumber monks and fog rolls in without apology. But that's where you find her Hilda, or rather, Saint Hild to those who like titles. But tonight, let's call her just Hilda. It's more fitting for someone whose power lived in listening, not in lording. It's the year 657, and you're standing at the beginning of something small but unshakable. Hilda's Abbey is still being built, stone by stone, prayer by prayer. And even now, before the walls are complete, people come. Women with wool baskets, men with questions, children with scraped knees. Not because she promised miracles, but because she offered something rarer reason. You see, Hilda didn't come to this cliff to be seen. She came to shape. And unlike so many others in early medieval England, where power often came with a helmet or a sword, Hilda built her influence with parchment, with patience, and with an uncanny ability to read both scripture and people. The truth is, monastic life wasn't supposed to be glamorous. And yet somehow, hers becomes magnetic. Her abbey welcomes both men and women. That alone is revolutionary. And she governs both with such balance, it unsettles more than a few neighboring priests. Now you might be picturing a quiet nun with folded hands, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Hilda isn't a wilting lily in a chapel corner. She is descended from royalty niece to King Edwin of Northumbria, and could have lived in a hall with silk drapes and silver spoons. But instead, she chooses celibacy, silence, and daily chores that include fetching water and raising livestock. So here's your historical fact. For the night Hilda founded one of the most influential double monasteries in Anglo-Saxon England, a place where monks and nuns lived under the same rule, learned in the same halls, and studied under the same woman. And your quirky detail. Her monastery was so respected that 5 bishops were trained there, and one poet, a shy cowherd, who couldn't sing a note until Hilda encouraged him. But we'll get to him later. Now let's tug at a scholarly thread for a moment. Some argue that Hilda's early success stemmed more from her royal bloodline than from her spiritual insight, that her reputation as a wise leader was amplified by politics, not piety. But let's be honest, plenty of nobles tried the cloistered life and failed spectacularly. Hilda didn't. She flourished, and not with sword or scandal, but with governance grace and a frankly astonishing grasp of community psychology. And that's the thing about Hilda. Her authority isn't loud. It doesn't swagger. It listens. You can almost hear her voice, not raised, but certain, as she mediates between quarreling monks or redirects a young nun's curiosity from gossip to Greek verbs. People follow her not out of fear, but because her judgment feels clean, measured, anchored, like her abbey, rooted deep in wind and stone. And if you're wondering how a woman could wield that kind of influence in the 7th century when women rarely got to rule much more than a hearth. The answer is simple. She made herself indispensable. By knowing Scripture better than her male counterparts. By managing land better than half the ealdormen. By seeing the long game when others only saw tribal feuds and border skirmishes. There's a kind of magic in that, isn't there? Not the fire and lightning kind, but the kind that says, yes, the world is messy, but you can shape it with words and wisdom and the occasional sharp look. At Whitby, discipline was expected, but not in a punitive way. Think of it more as orchestration. Hilda the abbess conductor, guiding her monastic choir through the daily liturgy, through script copying, through managing livestock, and teaching Latin to the illiterate. You get the feeling that even the roosters woke early just to avoid her disapproval. And yet, she wasn't severe. Not really. Reports from the time say she was beloved, that her presence brought calm, that people left her company a little wiser, and not because they were scolded, but because they were heard. That perhaps is her quiet rebellion. In an age of kings and conquests, Hilda wins through constancy, through intellect, through a life so unshakably stable that even kings start visiting the abbey not to preach, but to listen. So here in this modest coastal cloister begins something rare, a woman's voice that carries across generations, across kingdoms, and yes, even across sea winds. And you sitting there now, drifting toward sleep, can still feel her presence if you listen. Not as a myth, not as a miracle, but as a mind that made space for others. As a woman who chose a quieter path and made it the most powerful one in the room. The wind off the North Sea still howls some nights, the kind that rattles shutters and whispers through chapel stones. But inside Whitby, under the steady eye of Hilda, life moves not with fear, but with rhythm. The bells toll for prayer, the candles flicker for study, and something rare begins to settle into the bones of the Abbey order, not the order of brute force or royal decree, the kind that grows when people trust the one leading them. You wake before sunrise just as Hilda would have. There's no sleeping in at her monastery. The rule, likely a blend of Roman influence and Celtic customs, demands balance, ora et labora, pray and work. You gather at the chapel, a cold mist hugging your woolen robe. The sea below is invisible in the dark, but you can hear it always there, like a heartbeat under the earth. Hilda's presence is already felt before she arrives. A room changes when she enters, not because she demands it, but because people instinctively straighten, not out of fear, out of respect. Here's tonight's historical fact. By the mid-7th century, Hilda was regarded as one of the greatest educators of her day. Kings consulted her on matters of politics and theology. She governed not just with discipline, but with compassion, creating one of the most stable and intellectually vibrant religious communities in Anglo-Saxon England. And now, for your curious detail, Hilda's monastery hosted something called the Synod of Whitby in 664, a formal church council that would decide the future of Christianity in England. What calendar to follow? When to celebrate Easter? Who held authority? This was no minor affair. It was the theological equivalent of a sword fight between Rome and the Celtic Church. And guess what? It happened at her abbey. That's right. A woman's monastery hosted one of the most important debates in English religious history. The fact that kings and bishops traveled to this clifftop monastery, debating the tides of doctrine while chickens wandered through the courtyard, tells you everything you need to know about her quiet power, and the academic debate scholars still argue today whether Hilda supported the Celtic tradition or the Roman rule. Some believe she leaned toward the Celtic way, closer to her roots, its independence, its flexible leadership. Others say she supported the Roman side out of practical wisdom. Rome brought unity, and unity would protect fragile Christian communities. But here's the twist. Even after her preference was overruled, Hilda didn't sulk or resist. She adapted. That's the real strength, not in winning, but in leading through change. After the synod ruled in favor of Roman custom, she didn't grumble. She reformed her abbey accordingly, maintaining harmony without compromising her dignity. And that, perhaps, is where kings begin to notice her. Not as a religious oddity, but as a rare kind of stateswoman. In a time when kingdoms rose and fell with the flick of a sword, Hilda offered something far more durable: continuity. She wasn't chasing glory. She was building infrastructure, intellectual, moral, and human. Her double monastery at Whitby becomes a kind of early medieval think tank. Young men who train here go on to become bishops, abbots, and royal advisors. One of them, Bishop John of Beverley, is said to have been so beloved that miracles were later attributed to his tomb. But even John would probably admit that the real miracle was getting through Hilda's schooling without being corrected on Latin declensions. And then there's the cowherd. Yes, this is where the story gets a little magical. A quiet, humble servant named Kedman, assigned to watch the animals and avoid the singing contests held by the monks. He was shy, couldn't hold a note, always slipped out of the hall when it was his turn to perform. But one night, legend says, an angel came to him in a dream, told him to sing, and he did. Not just any song, but a hymn so beautiful, so theologically rich, that it left the learned monks speechless. The next morning, they brought him to Hilda. Now, if she were a lesser leader, she might have dismissed him. A cowherd claiming divine inspiration, ridiculous. But not Hilda. She listened, encouraged him, recognized that whatever else was true, this man had a gift. She had him educated, yes, a man who couldn't read, and helped him compose biblical poetry in the vernacular. The result, Kedman becomes the first named English poet whose work still survives. And all because a powerful woman took a shy man seriously. There's something almost revolutionary in that the abbess who trains bishops, teaches scripture, debates kings, and still finds time to nurture a poet among the pigs. At night, after the bells stop and the wind returns, you can almost hear her footsteps in the cloister walk. Not hurried, not loud, but measured. She's checking on the scribes, asking after the sick, watching the stars perhaps, and wondering what small changes might still be made tomorrow. And that's where the heart of Hilda's influence lives. Not in her titles, not in the abbey stones, but in how she makes people feel seen. The cowherd, the bishop, the kitchen maid, the king. It's no wonder kings listened. She didn't flatter them. She steadied them. Her abbey wasn't a court, but somehow it had more clarity than most courts ever did. You can feel it now, can't you? The warmth of candlelight against stone walls. The soft crackle of ink drying on a page. The sense that something good is being built here, not for glory, but for good. And you laying there with eyes half closed have already been part of it. For just a moment, you've walked beside a woman who changed her world not by shouting, but by staying. You wake to the distant call of gulls and the soft knock of a wooden spoon against a pot. Breakfast at Whitby isn't lavish. Warm porridge a crust of bread, maybe a few wild berries if the novices have been industrious. But it's not the food that nourishes most here, it's the rhythm. The abbey hums like a living thing. You can hear it in the quiet shuffle of sandals, the soft turn of vellum pages, the gentle echo of recitation in the learning hall. And at the center of it all is Hilda, not a queen, not a pope, not even a priest in the traditional sense, but somehow the axis around which this entire spiritual and intellectual village turns. This is your historical fact. For tonight, Hilda wasn't just respected, she was venerated in her own lifetime. Even the Venerable Bede, the early English historian and monk, wrote about her with the kind of awe usually reserved for martyrs and saints. He described her wisdom, her justice, and her almost supernatural gift for leadership. And again, let's not forget, this was a world where women weren't usually invited to the table, let alone asked to preside over it. And now, for your wonderfully quirky detail legend, says that when Hilda died, the bells rang on their own. Not just in Whitby, but in Hartlepool, where she had led an earlier monastery. Monks and nuns, hundreds of miles apart, claimed to see a beam of light rise from her cell to the sky. Some even claimed to hear celestial music. A bit of holy PR, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, grief and love told their own truth. So let's talk about how a woman like Hilda could have this kind of pull, not just in spiritual matters, but in royal politics. See, medieval England wasn't unified. It was a mess of shifting kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, all squabbling, forming alliances, breaking them, and then having the nerve to write it all down like it was divine will. Kings came and went like weather. But ideas planted by someone steady, those lingered. Hilda wasn't just a leader of nuns. She was an advisor to kings like Oswiu of Northumbria, who may have ruled with a sword, but often listened with an ear tilted toward her quiet voice. Oswiu had a complicated reign. He'd seen civil war dynastic rivalries, pagan uprisings. He didn't need more soldiers. He needed counsel. And that's where the scholarly debate begins. Was Hilda shaping Northumbrian politics from behind cloister walls? Or was her influence exaggerated by later writers looking for a spiritual heroine? Some scholars point out that she trained multiple bishops and had the king's ear suggesting she was more like a behind-the-scenes diplomat. Others argue her influence was overstated to reinforce Christian ideals of holy femininity, packaging her as a tame yet powerful woman, a role model who didn't threaten the status quo too much. But there's another possibility. Maybe she was powerful, precisely because she wasn't trying to be. Hilda's strength came not from ambition, but from attention. She noticed what others overlooked. She valued learning character and the long game, which brings us to today's little window into Abbey life. Imagine the scriptorium wooden benches, wax tablets, pots of ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Hilda walks slowly between the rows, commenting on handwriting, correcting errors, reminding scribes to pause and breathe. Every book copied is a prayer, a legacy, a survival plan. You pause to glance over a scribe's shoulder. He's transcribing a psalm in Latin. His letters are neat square, perfectly aligned like soldiers. Another novice nearby is struggling. His ink has pulled the script smudged. He sighs, and you see Hilda lean in. Not to scold, to guide. That's the rhythm here. Not punishment, but patience. And maybe that's why kings listened. Because in a world obsessed with conquest, Hilda built a culture. She didn't wield power like a weapon. She let it bloom around her, like a garden tended daily. watered by care, pruned with kindness. Later in the evening, you walk the cliffside path, wrapped in your cloak against the sea wind. The abbey is behind you, silhouetted by candlelight, and the stars above are bright, unpolluted by anything but time. Hilda walked this path too, likely many times. Perhaps she came here to think after long meetings with royal messengers, or to weep privately after the death of a beloved novice, or simply to feel the horizon stretch beyond the demands of abbey life. And though she's long gone now, her footprints linger, etched not in stone, but in the very pattern of how English Christianity evolved. Inclusive, educated, steady. Like her. Back inside, the abbey grows quiet again. The younger girls are already asleep in their straw beds, and the older women hum softly as they prepare the lamps for night prayers. Hilda walks the cloister one more time. You feel it in the air, in the hush that descends when she passes. She doesn't need to raise her voice. She never has. You lie down the stone floor, cool beneath your pallet, and think perhaps the truest mark of a leader is what happens in their silence. What endures, not because they commanded it, but because they inspired it. And here, on this windswept cliff, in a time most people forget, a woman named Hilda did just that. She whispered, and the world listened. You're up before the sun today. The sea is still a gray smear beyond the cliffs, and dew clings to the grass like forgotten prayers. Whitby Abbey stirs slowly in the dawn, its stone bones warming inch by inch. Inside, the sisters are already awake, singing the soft melodies of matins, their voices rising like breath from the earth. You trail the edges of their sound until you reach the chapter house where decisions are quietly made. Not declarations, not decrees, but conversations led as always by Hilda. Today's historical truth. Hilda presided over the Synod of Whitby in 64 AD, one of the most important religious debates in early English Christianity. A synod, a fancy word for a church meeting, wasn't exactly designed for a woman's voice, and yet there she was hosting it at her abbey, listening to arguments from both sides, guiding the tone of a conflict that could have split the soul of a kingdom. The debate itself, the Roman versus Celtic calculation of Easter. Yes, Easter. That's what nearly tore the Christian world of Britain in half. Because one group followed Rome's calendar, and the other followed Irish Celtic traditions. It sounds quaint now, like arguing over what day to have a picnic. But back then, it was cosmic. It was about authority, who held it, and what it meant to be truly Christian. And now for tonight's peculiar little gem, the Celtic monks, who came to the synod, supposedly wore their hair in a very specific way, a tonsure cut straight across the front, like a bowl gone wrong, while the Romans shaved just the crown. Haircuts as theological battlegrounds. Imagine that. A man's forehead becoming an argument for divine legitimacy. It's oddly appropriate for a time when symbolism was everything and scissors doubled as statements. Now here's where the scholarly debate blooms. How much influence did Hilda have on the outcome? The official winner was the Roman method. King Oswiu sided with Rome after a famous speech about St. Peter holding the keys to heaven. But Bede hints that Hilda supported the Celtic side. So did she lose? Well, define lose. Yes, her preferred tradition faded. But her abbey, it grew. Her leadership, it endured. Even those who disagreed with her trusted her to hold the space where the disagreement happened. And that's a different kind of power, isn't it? Not in winning arguments, but in creating the room for them to be spoken. You slip into the back of the chapter house now. The room is bare, but solemn. Stone benches curve around the walls. A simple wooden cross anchors the room, and light spills in through high unshuttered slits. You imagine the monks arriving Roman bishops in their finer robes, Celtic monks smelling of moss and parchment, everyone a little tense, a little hungry, and very aware they're standing in the presence of a woman whose authority doesn't need embroidery to be felt. Hilda doesn't rush. She listens. She nods. And when voices rise, she raises a hand, not sharply, but gently, as though reminding them they are in fact here to serve heaven, not their egos. It's easy to forget how revolutionary that was. That a woman was not only allowed to host such a synod, but trusted to do it with wisdom. And it's easy, too, to overlook how much of that power came not from dominance, but from discipline. That's what you notice most during the rest of the day. The discipline of care. The Abbey is a hum of quiet responsibilities. Scriptorium, scribes, tracing delicate inked letters, gardeners, tending to medicinal herbs, kitchen sisters, soaking beans, and stirring stews that have been passed down by whispered tradition, not cookbook. Even the beehives hum with purpose, and Hilda, she moves through it all with the same attention she gave the synod. She stops to ask the herb woman how the wormwood is faring. She checks on a younger sister's Latin. She leans in to smell the bread dough rising in a warm nook near the hearth. You can tell she doesn't see these acts as separate from faith. To her, tending a sore tooth with sage oil or copying a psalm with clean fingers is just as holy as chanting a liturgy. It's all part of a larger system, a worldview in which knowledge, care, and God are not in competition. Which leads us to the next lingering debate. Was Hilda's Abbey truly co-ed? Some records suggest yes, that both men and women lived and studied there. Not in the same rooms, of course, but within the same cloistered complex. Think of it as an early experiment in educational equality. Others argue that the idea of co-ed monasteries is a romanticized invention, misunderstood through later translations. But you've walked the Abbey now. You've seen both the nuns' dormitory and the smaller men's quarters. You've heard stories of young Caedmon, a lowly cowherd in Whitby service, who was too shy to sing until Hilda encouraged him. He went on to compose what some consider the first recorded poem in Old English. A farmhand turned poet. Because Hilda said, "Try," and that's what sticks with you as the sun sinks. The legacy of a woman who made space not just for kings and monks and ecclesiastical arguments, but for small voices, for people who didn't fit the mold, for the kind of learning that starts in silence. Night returns, and the sea wind picks up. You huddle near a fire, now tucked beside a wall, warmed by the kitchen ovens. A few sisters are still awake sewing in the dim light, their needles glinting like tiny stars. You can hear distant hooves, perhaps a messenger arriving late, or a pilgrim hoping for shelter. The Abbey never truly sleeps, and neither does its memory. You rest your head against cool stone and close your eyes. Hilda once sat here too, not to command, but to listen, not to fight, but to foster. A woman in a world of men who still found a way to lead not with force, but with faith. And tomorrow, she'll do it all again. The Abbey wakes slowly after the synod, but the echoes remain. There's something about decisions, especially the big history-bending kind, that lingers in the stones long after voices go quiet. Today, the debate over Easter has faded into memory, but you can feel it in the hush of the scriptorium, in the careful way novices whisper over parchment in the new timbre of the prayers. Things shift, even when people pretend they haven't, and you find yourself trailing Hilda again. She's back to walking the perimeter of her domain, and there's no crown on her head, no scepter in hand. Yet somehow the path seems to part gently in her wake. Maybe it's respect. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's just the way she moves, with the calm certainty of someone who already knows how this day will end. Here's your historical fact. Hilda of Whitby trained not only monks and nuns, but also future bishops. Kings consulted her. The Venerable Bede, our friendly neighborhood medieval historian, goes so far as to say that nobles and clergy alike came to her for advice, treating her as a kind of spiritual compass. She didn't wear armor, but she influenced armies. She didn't write laws, but her wisdom shaped those who did. That's where things get odd and oddly beautiful. Because Hilda's authority didn't spring from brute force or noble birth, though yes, she was of royal stock. It came from something quieter. It came from knowledge, from hospitality, from the fact that when she opened her mouth, people listened, including men who were used to hearing only themselves. Now here's the quirky detail to tuck into your sleeve tonight. There's a story, half legend, half truth, that Hilda once saw a miraculous sign in the sky, a string of lights appearing above the abbey like a row of lamps carried by angels. Some say it marked the passing of a holy soul. Others claim it was an omen. But you wonder, what if it was just hope, a visible breath of light in a world too often dark? This brings us to tonight's scholarly debate. Was Hilda a proto-feminist? No, she wouldn't have used the term. And yes, applying modern frameworks to ancient lives is always a bit messy. But the question stands, did she, in her quiet way, resist the narrow roles allotted to women? The argument splits the parchment. Some scholars say yes. Hilda defied norms simply by leading, by educating men, by shaping policy in a church that barely tolerated female voices. Others warn against projecting modern ideas backward, insisting that Hilda operated fully within the expectations of her time. But here's the twist. Maybe she didn't need rebellion to be revolutionary. Maybe the quiet assertion of competence again and again, day after day, is its own form of protest. Maybe raising poets from stable hands, guiding kings with gentle correction, and building a center of learning that welcomed both genders was more powerful than any shouted demand. You follow her out to the gardens now. They're ringed with low stone walls and soft clumps of herbs time-rue sage comfrey. A young novice is kneeling by a bed of feverfew, reading from a worn scrap of parchment. Hilda crouches beside her, not to correct, but to listen. Then she points to a nearby patch of valerian and murmurs something that makes the girl laugh. This is what leadership looks like when it's not trying to look like leadership. Later in the scriptorium, you linger near the windows. The scent of oak, gall ink, and scraped parchment floats in the air, mixed with beeswax and wool cloaks. A monk dips his quill, with careful reverence, shaping each letter like a prayer. These are not just words, they're legacies. Hilda believed in recording things, not to boast, not to control, but to remember. Memory, she knew, was its own form of power. It's why her abbey maintained one of the most respected centers of literacy in Northumbria. And it's why so many of the great clerics and chroniclers passed through her cloisters. Because they were taught not just to write, but to notice. to think, to hold silence as seriously as speech. You sit by a high window as dusk begins to fall. The sea has turned from steel to silver, and gulls cry overhead like ancient voices. You imagine Caedmon, yes, that same tongue-tied cowherd, sitting in this very corner, scribbling out lines of verse that he once feared to sing aloud. You wonder how many stories lived in these walls, unrecorded, unadorned, but no less important. And still, Hilda walks. She pauses in the chapel now. It's modest, warmed by candlelight and the low hum of sung prayer. No grand altar, no jeweled chalice, just faith in its simplest form, bread, wine, and the soft shuffle of feet. One of the elderly sisters falters while standing. Hilda moves to her without hesitation, steadies her arm, and helps her back into the wooden pew. There's no ceremony in the act, no performance, just care. And perhaps that's what you're meant to see tonight. That sometimes the most enduring kind of power doesn't look like power at all. It looks like presence. It looks like patience. It looks like a woman who made herself into a home for others' learning. You settle into your cot in the guest chamber, your blanket smelling faintly of smoke and lavender. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once. Farther off, the tide breaks in rhythm against the cliffs. You close your eyes and let your mind drift. You've learned something that history books don't always teach. That real influence isn't about volume, it's about resonance. Hilda didn't shout. She didn't conquer. She didn't demand. She made a place where voices could grow. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry a bit of that with you into the night. You wake to soft bells in the far distance, neither urgent nor loud, but deliberate, like the Abbey is reminding everyone that time is a rhythm, not a race. Outside your chamber, the mist from the sea still lingers, veiling the earth in hush and dew. The monastery doesn't bustle, it breathes. And again, Hilda is already moving through it, like she's been up before the sun stretched its arms. You follow her through the narrow cloister passage, past moss-dappled arches and stone paths worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. She stops to examine a small crack in a wall, probably meaningless to you, but meaningful to her. That's how she is. She sees the weak points. The hairline fractures the subtle things no one else pays attention to. And she tends them before they grow. Here's your historical fact for the night under Hilda's leadership. Whitby Abbey didn't just grow spiritually, it became one of the major centers for education and scripture copying in the Anglo-Saxon world. Monks trained, they were renowned for their literacy, and the Abbey helped standardize both Latin and Old English writing practices. And here's a quirky detail. It's said that Hilda required even her noble-born postulants to do manual labor, chop wood, carry water, dig soil alongside the lower-born. Not because she liked to humble people, though she might have, but because she believed in shared effort. That no knowledge was pure unless it was earned by the hand as well as the mind. That kind of leadership, quietly radical, often went unnoticed by the world beyond. But within Whitby's walls, it shaped lives. Which brings us to the academic debate of this part. Was Whitby Abbey more of a political institution than a religious one? Historians don't quite agree. Some argue that given its royal patronage and Hilda's own noble blood, the Abbey functioned like a soft power extension of the Northumbrian court, a place where alliances were sealed, ecclesiastical appointments discussed, and delicate matters managed out of sight. Others insist that it remained at its heart a spiritual retreat more library than palace, more cloister than court. The truth, as always, seems to drift somewhere between the lines, because the people who came to Whitby weren't only monks and nuns. They were bishops, reeves, emissaries. They came for clarity, for counsel, for calm. And what they found was a woman who somehow managed to untangle the knots they didn't even know they had. You glimpse her now in the refectory, not at the high table, but seated alongside two younger sisters, breaking bread with a slice of soft cheese and dried apples. She listens more than she speaks, nodding occasionally, never interrupting. One of the girls is clearly nervous, fumbling her cup, but Hilda doesn't laugh. She sets her own goblet down, slowly, silently showing her how to steady it. This is how trust is built, not through ceremony, but through attention. Later, as the sky begins to lighten, you join the Abbey's morning gathering. A psalm rises not perfectly, but warmly from dozens of voices. You don't know the words, but the cadence is enough. It's a kind of music made by people who believe in trying together. And there near the front, Hilda stands tall, still utterly present, not directing, not commanding, just being. And somehow, that's enough. As the prayers fade and the congregation disperses, she walks with a visiting monk. He's older, white-bearded, and slightly stooped, but still opinionated. You catch only snippets of their conversation, debates over relics, liturgical correctness, some dispute over a bishop's recent letter. Hilda listens, then replies with something gentle and clever that makes him laugh despite himself. You realize, not for the first time, that her power lies in making others feel smart even when she's 5 steps ahead. In the courtyard, she stops to touch the leaves of a rosemary bush. It's an odd thing to pause for, but you're beginning to learn the little moments are the big ones here. Now you notice a young boy with a splinted arm sitting alone on the wall's edge, watching the older novices train in Latin declensions. He looks ready to cry. Without a word, Hilda walks over and sits beside him. She says something so quiet you don't catch it. But whatever it is, it works. His shoulders drop. He breathes again. This isn't just mentorship, it's ministry. And maybe that's the core of her mystery. Hilda doesn't rule, she restores. You visit the Abbey's scriptorium again that evening. A candle flickers beside each desk. Quills scratch in rhythm. In one corner, a novice frowns over a passage in Bede's Chronicle. Hilda kneels beside him, her eyes scanning the words. She corrects a single phrase, not because it's wrong, but because it could be clearer. That's the difference between editing and elevating. And Hilda always does the latter. By now, you know she's not flashy. There are no miracles attached to her name, no bloody battles or fiery speeches. But in a world that often wrote women out, she simply kept writing herself back in line by line, act by act, gesture by gesture. The sun sinks and lanterns are lit. The Abbey turns quiet again, cloaked in the velvet of twilight. You sit under an archway, watching the stars appear one by one. Somewhere, a harp begins to play. The tune is old and sad and hopeful all at once, and you wonder how many others sat just like this century after century, grateful for a place made not of stone and rule, but of kindness and thought. You don't have the answer, but you do know this kings listened to Hilda. So did poets, and tonight, so did you. The wind that rolls off the North Sea tonight smells like salt and ash, like something freshly scrubbed by the sky. You step out of the dormitory, quietly following the worn stone path toward the edge of the cliff, where the land falls away into mist and gulls circle like drifting parchment scraps. And once again, Hilda is there before you. She's looking out to sea, not lost in thought, but deep in it. There's a difference. Her posture suggests she's waiting for something, or someone. You take your place a respectful distance away and simply watch. Tonight's historical fact might surprise you. Whitby Abbey, under Hilda's rule, became the meeting place for one of the most significant ecclesiastical councils in early English history, the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD. It wasn't a small tea and crumpet affair. This synod brought together clergy and royalty to determine whether the church in England would follow the Roman or Celtic method of calculating Easter, among other theological differences. Imagine that. A coastal abbey, led by a woman, became the deciding stage for how an entire island would measure time and holiness. Now here's your quirky detail. Even though Hilda herself leaned toward the Celtic traditions, closer to the Irish monastic practices she was formed in, she accepted the Roman ruling with characteristic grace once the king decided. And then, like she always did, she got back to work. No tantrum, no grudge. Just the quiet continuation of a greater mission. Which brings us to a debate that still tickles academic minds, like the sea tickles the cliffside rocks. Was Hilda a political player in a monk's robe, or a genuine spiritual guide whose influence accidentally overlapped with courtly power? Some scholars argue that her abbey functioned like a royal court in miniature, that she was essentially a queen of the church negotiating alliances behind her veil. Others insist this view oversimplifies what she actually was, a fiercely intelligent woman who believed education and faith could steady a nation better than any sword. But standing here watching her watch the sea, you get the sense that Hilda didn't care for categories. She was neither pawn nor bishop, she was the board. And the game only happened because she kept it level. You follow her back inside the abbey after a while. A rider has arrived, hooves clattering against the cobbled path. A messenger, shivering and out of breath, hands her a scroll. No seal, just simple twine. She reads it under a torch's glow, her face calm, but her fingers tightening on the edge. Then she folds it, once, twice, tucks it into her sleeve, and moves on without a word. You wonder what news could shift her like that. A death, a disagreement, a summons, but she says nothing. And no one asks, because here, part of trust is not demanding explanation. Later, you find yourself walking through the cloister garden. The herbs smell stronger at night, sage, and thyme crushed beneath soft footfalls. A few novices kneel with lanterns, tending to winter kale or checking on rain barrels. You notice how, even in the stillness, there's movement. Quiet labor, a rhythm that doesn't need shouting. Hilda passes through like breath. She leans over a novice and adjusts the angle of the spade, not with critique, just correction. A lesson made of gesture, and the novice nods, lit with a small, almost embarrassed smile. After compline, you find her again, not in her private cell, but in the library alcove translating. A candle burns low beside her, its flame bending with every draft. You glance over her shoulder. Latin, yes, but not just scripture. Poetry. You didn't expect that. But then again, why not? You watch as she traces one line with her fingertip lips, moving slightly as she murmurs the old words. Something about a garden, a gate, a light that never dims. You realize then that even abbesses need beauty. that even abbesses need escape. In the room beyond, a girl begins to cry. It's soft muffled into wool sleeves, but unmistakable. Hilda doesn't hesitate. She rises, slips through the curtain, and kneels beside her. You don't hear what's said. You're not supposed to. But the crying slows and stops, and two hands meet in the dark. Later you ask one of the older monks, without naming names, why everyone listens to her. He says, because she listens to God. And more importantly, she listens to us. You're not sure you believe in God the way they do, but you believe in Hilda. And maybe that's enough. The moon is high now, silvering the abbey roofs. The bells will not ring again until matins, but the air is full of unspoken prayers, like doves resting on ledges. You return to your place near the hearth, where a few embers glow beneath ash. Someone has left a bowl of honeyed oats nearby, still warm, and you wonder not for the first time how many people found warmth here when the world offered only cold. There is no throne at Whitby, no crown, no golden scepter or jeweled altar, just Hilda. Her hands ink-stained and soil-darkened. Her eyes always watching, always seeing. And somehow, her word is the one even kings don't ignore. You lie down. The stone beneath your back is hard but familiar now. The sea wind slips through the cracks in the walls like breath between lips, and sleep comes not quickly but fully, like a gate opening, like the kind of rest you earn after work done well. Tomorrow you'll rise again. The bells will call you, the abbey will welcome you, and Hilda will already be moving. As always. But for now, you rest. You are part of something bigger than yourself. And for once, that feels like peace. The sky is still gray when the bells call matins, the sound weaving through cold stone corridors like smoke. You sit up slowly, arms wrapped around your knees, listening to the ancient rhythm of monastic time, the way it divides the day, not by urgency, but by devotion. Another day begins, another whisper in history's long chant, and just like that, she appears again. Not sweeping in with grandeur or ceremony, but steady quiet, like the sun itself already present before you notice her warmth. Hilda, you follow her without a word. The abbey is beginning to stir soft footsteps on flagstone, the rustle of robes a creak from the kitchen. But she walks toward the garden, not the herb one this time, but the graveyard beyond it. A gentle slope marked with wooden crosses and stone slabs, some tilted, some weathered blank. You wouldn't expect it, but Hilda comes here often. Today she's come to visit a man named Caedmon. Here comes the historical fact. Caedmon was a cowherd barely literate and terrified of singing in public. But under Hilda's encouragement, he became the first known English poet whose name we remember. Not a king, not a warrior, a cowherd who, according to legend, received the gift of song in a dream. Hilda didn't just allow him into the abbey's community, she nurtured his gift, encouraged him to put sacred stories into the Anglo-Saxon tongue. She saw beauty where others saw labor. She believed that poetry could be a form of praise. Now Caedmon's hymn is studied in classrooms centuries later. And you wonder how many songs would have been silenced if Hilda hadn't listened. The quirky detail. Well, Caedmon was so nervous about performing in front of others that he used to hide in the stables when asked to sing. It took a dream, and probably a nudge from divine intervention, to coax his voice out. But the woman who believed in education for all, regardless of gender or background, recognized the melody long before anyone else did. Here's where scholars still circle the question: was Hilda a rare anomaly, or was she emblematic of a quieter, now forgotten movement of female intellectual stewardship in the early medieval church? Some argue she was a brilliant exception, unusually well-connected, born into nobility, and uniquely situated in a time of transition. Others point to letters, ruins, and oral traditions, suggesting that more women like her existed: teachers, scribes, abbesses of double monasteries whose work simply wasn't preserved. Because that's the trick, isn't it? What survives gets called rare. What disappears gets called unimportant. But Cædmon survives. His hymn survives. And Hilda's fingerprints are all over both. You walk back from the graveyard with the sound of gulls overhead echoing like faded chant notes. Back inside, there's a seminar of sorts unfolding in the scriptorium. Hilda is there again, of course, but today she's not teaching. She's listening. A young monk is translating a Latin psalm into Old English. He stumbles. Hilda doesn't correct him. She just waits. He finds the right word eventually, something softer, more fitting, and she nods. You're struck by that. Her power isn't in the commanding. It's in the trusting. There's parchment stacked in neat bundles on the long table. Copies of scriptures, yes, but also histories, riddles, poems. Some pages carry careful illuminations in the margins, small rabbits, birds' vines, a bit of whimsy among all the formality. And you realize this place, this abbey, it's not just a sanctuary. It's a publishing house, a thought factory, a seed vault of culture. And Hilda, she's the gardener, the architect, the midwife to ideas. Later that afternoon, a visitor arrives. Not royal, not clerical, just a woman with weathered hands and a child pressed to her hip. She doesn't bow. She just stands nervous as Hilda approaches. The woman explains her daughter has visions, strange words in her sleep, symbols drawn in the dirt with her fingers. The villagers whisper. The priest is wary. Hilda listens, really listens. Then she says gently, let her stay a while. No judgment, no ceremony, just welcome. Because here, difference isn't danger, it's potential. And that girl, she'll grow up to illustrate the Abbey's Gospel of John in cobalt blue and curling gold. Her visions will become margins of mystery, quiet, glowing, beautiful. At dusk, you find yourself alone in the refectory, sipping warm barley broth. The fire crackles in the hearth. A few sisters hum softly as they sweep. One of them has braided her hair in a pattern that matches the Celtic knot on the wall. Even the simplest things echo meaning here. You think about Hilda again. You always do. Not because she's grand, but because she's grounded. Her authority isn't built on fear, it's built on presence. It's the kind of power that doesn't demand silence, it listens through it. As the sky fades into blue velvet outside the Abbey windows, you wonder what it would have been like to be a girl under her care. To grow up in a place where your mind was not only allowed to bloom, but expected to. Where curiosity wasn't sin, but prayer. Where even a cowherd's voice could become sacred. You curl into your cloak, letting sleep approach like a slow tide. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, the sea murmurs. Someone laughs in the kitchen. A page is turned, and in the darkness, you swear you can hear her voice, low, steady, humming an old hymn you don't recognize, but somehow know by heart. Hilda of Whitby. Not queen. Not saint, not yet. Just a woman with a door always open, and a fire always lit. A woman kings consulted poets thanked, and you simply followed. And maybe that's enough for tonight. The storm begins just before midnight. Not thunder and lightning, but a storm of parchment arguments and anticipation. Word has come to Whitby, messengers cloaked in rain and rank politics. A great council is being summoned, and this time it's not just bishops and barons who'll weigh in. Hilda has been asked to host it. Yes, her. Not merely attend, not observe. Host, the Synod of Whitby. And so begins one of the most quietly consequential gatherings in early English history. You watch as preparations unfold, not with banners and trumpets, but with long benches being scrubbed and firewood stacked high in the corners of the great hall. Hilda moves through it all like a conductor whose orchestra doesn't even know it's warming up. Here comes your historical fact. In 664, the Synod of Whitby was held to resolve a major conflict between two branches of Christianity in England, the Celtic tradition from Iona and the Roman tradition. The disagreement, among other things, when to celebrate Easter. Yes, truly. The resurrection of Christ, arguably the central date in Christian theology, was being observed on different days, depending on where you lived. It wasn't just about liturgical neatness. It meant different fasts, different calendars, different senses of time. It also meant political tension. And Hilda's Abbey, sitting at the crossroads of these cultures, was the perfect place to settle it. Or so the kings thought. The quirky detail. Some say Hilda herself leaned toward the Celtic side. She had been trained in its rhythms, its simpler monastic ways, its poetry and independence. But when the vote was cast by male bishops and noblemen, Rome won. And Hilda, despite her preferences, submitted to the outcome with grace. Because peace for her mattered more than pride. The scholarly debate. Oh, it's a lively one. Did the Synod mark the end of a native Christian expression in Britain, crushed beneath Roman conformity? Or was it a necessary unification in a time of tribal chaos? Some historians mourn what was lost. The earthy mysticism, the homegrown saints, the Irish lilt of the Psalms. Others argue it paved the way for greater cohesion, trade, and diplomatic strength. But all agree it changed the course of English religious life, and Hilda stood at the heart of it. You sit by the back wall as the guests arrive, Bishop Wilfrid with his smooth Latin and polished sandals, King Oswiu with a face like weathered bark abbots, and monks with ink-stained fingers. There's tension in the room. Not the kind that bursts, but the kind that simmers. This isn't just theology, it's identity. Hilda greets each man the same way, with a nod, a quiet welcome, and bread still warm from the oven. You can almost feel their discomfort at her calm. They expect pomp or protest. She offers tea and silence. And then the arguments begin. They go back and forth, debating the shape of tonsures. Yes, really haircuts were on the docket. The authority of Rome, the interpretation of Scripture, and of course, Easter. But it's not the arguments you remember. It's the way Hilda listens. Chin slightly tilted, eyes soft but sharp. She doesn't flinch when spoken over. She doesn't interrupt. And yet somehow, when she finally speaks, quiet, measured, the whole hall falls silent. She says unity must be built slowly or not at all. She says faith is not a wall, it is a well. She says if we cannot eat the same bread, then we should not pretend to pray the same prayers. And then she lets them continue. That's her power. By morning, the vote is cast. Rome prevails. And Hilda, she bows her head. No rage, no retreat. She she simply walks back to the kitchen and asks the sisters to prepare more stew. The guests will be hungry before their ride, but you notice something. The girls in the scriptorium keep writing Celtic dates in the margins for weeks afterward, and no one corrects them. Hilda may yield on paper, but she knows how long ink lasts. Later that week, she gathers the community. The council is gone, the great decision made. But Hilda speaks not of the outcome, but of continuity. She reminds them that God doesn't live in Rome or Iona. That language calendar custom they change. What doesn't kindness? Thought. Courage. You feel it then. That strange blend of loss and legacy. The way history bends. Not with sword swings, but with nods and silences. That night, as the sisters tuck themselves into pallets and straw mattresses, Hilda walks once more to the garden. The stars are out. The sea murmurs low against the cliffs. You follow her at a distance. She kneels by the well, not to draw water, but to listen. And in that moment, you wonder, was it really about Easter? Or was it always about the voices we let speak and the ones we don't? The whispers on the edge of empire. The abbess, whose words weren't written down, but echoed anyway. The girl in the scriptorium still copying Celtic songs in the margins. Maybe the synod ended with Rome's win. But it didn't end Hilda. She returns inside, trailing salt wind and candlelight. And you, still quiet, still wondering, follow behind. Because history doesn't close doors. It just adds hinges. You'd think that after hosting a kingdom-shaping synod, Hilda might take a well-earned rest. Maybe sit by the hearth, sip something warm, and sigh contentedly while the abbey hums back to its normal rhythm. But that's not how it works. Not in a world where knowledge travels slowly and memory even slower. Because now, everyone wants something from Hilda, a letter of endorsement, a judgment on a disputed land grant, a place for their niece, their daughter, their troublesome sister at Whitby. You see it clearly, the ripple effect of power, and how exhausting it is to hold that influence, especially when you never asked for it in the first place. Your historical fact for tonight: Whitby Abbey wasn't just a religious retreat. Under Hilda's leadership, it became one of the most important centers of learning and diplomacy in Anglo-Saxon England. Her reputation extended far beyond Northumbria. Kings sought her counsel. Clerics looked to her for guidance. And astonishingly, women of all ranks wrote to her, hoping to enter her community, even if just to scrub floors in the shadow of her mind. The quirky detail: Hilda believed that wisdom wasn't the sole property of noble birth or male study. She famously supported a humble cowherd named Kedman, who, despite being illiterate and terrified of singing, claimed to have received the gift of poetry in a dream. Instead of laughing, Hilda gave him a place at Whitby, encouraged his verses, and helped shape one of the earliest known examples of Old English Christian poetry. Yes, a woman abbot midwifed the birth of English literature in a barn, and the academic debate many scholars now ask was, Whitby truly a double monastery where men and women lived and learned together as equals, or was that equality more symbolic than structural? There's debate about whether women held real authority alongside men, or simply deferred to them once the spotlight faded. But when Hilda ruled, few questioned her balance of intellect and command. You wake to the sound of sparrows outside the stone window. Inside the abbey is already bustling. Girls are copying texts on scraped parchment, murmuring Latin aloud in sing-song cadences. One drops her pen. Another giggles, gets scolded, then giggles again. But your eyes are drawn to the outer field. Kedman is out there sitting awkwardly on a bench with 3 monks and a calf. His hands are folded. His lips move. And he's singing. It's not polished. It's not grand. But it's beautiful. Raw and round-edged and filled with something that feels bigger than the man singing it. His voice shakes. His knees twitch. The monks exchange glances that say, "Is this holy? And is this heresy in equal measure?" But Hilda just stands by the stable door, arms crossed, smiling softly. She doesn't interrupt. She lets the melody settle into the soil. Later she'll tell the bishop. And later still, that bishop will share the verses with a scribe who'll preserve them fragment by fragment. But right now, she just listens, and that you realize is her real gift. Hilda listens, not just politely, but fully, to fear, to dreams, to poetry, to men no one else bothers to hear. Later that day, she gathers the sisters around the long table in the refectory. A wind has picked up outside, the kind that sneaks through stone walls like a mouse with cold paws. She reads aloud from a new letter, an invitation from another abbey, asking for her opinion on their dispute over property lines. She sighs, but smiles. Even sheep fields need judges, she jokes. Then she points to the youngest girl in the room. You. Read me what you copied today. The girl turns crimson, but she stands. She holds the parchment with trembling hands. And she reads, not just clearly, but proudly. When she finishes, Hilda nods. "Well done," she says, and the girl glows so hard she could light a cathedral. You notice how she teaches, not by dominance, but by permission. Not with sermons, but with small invitations. Sing, speak, read. In a world that tells girls to stay quiet, Hilda makes space for their voices, however uncertain. The abbey that night smells of ink peat smoke and bread crusts. You sit near the fire and watch Hilda mend a wool cloak while dictating a reply to the property dispute. She doesn't pause when threading the needle, even as she says, "Tell them the stone wall predates the fence and that moss doesn't lie." You almost laugh. Of course moss doesn't lie. It grows where it grows, just like truth. The abbey is quiet by midnight, sisters breathing deeply in sleep, the pages of half-written gospels tucked under sleeping arms, the ghost of a melody still hovering in the beams from Kedman's voice. And Hilda, she's in the garden again, this time not at the well, but beneath the yew tree. You sit beside her, say nothing. She doesn't ask why you're there, just hands you a piece of bread and breaks off another for herself. You know she says the trick isn't teaching them everything. It's helping them believe they already know something. You nod, though you're not sure you fully understand. She doesn't mind, because what she says next isn't for you, or the cowherd poet, or the kings who send her scrolls and requests. It's for the wind, for the quiet, for the centuries to come. Let them write poems in barns, she whispers. Let them dream in Latin and wake in song. Then she stands, brushes off her cloak, and disappears into the hall, leaving you with crumbs moonlight and a growing sense that something important just happened. You stay seated. You stay listening. And somewhere far off, a melody begins again. You'd expect that a woman like Hilda would eventually grow tired of questions of visitors, of being the one everyone turns to when nothing makes sense. But no, she only grows quieter. And with her quiet, somehow comes more strength. The abbey has grown again. New buildings rise like ribs around the chapel, filled with women who've walked for days or months to get here. They've heard rumors that there's a woman on a northern cliff who listens like a priest and teaches like a prophet, that she gives the poor a voice and the learned something new to think about. Tonight you're walking alongside Hilda through the corridors by candlelight. The rushes beneath your feet whisper with each step. She pauses now, and then listening, always listening. And when she finally speaks, it's not about kings or politics or Latin verses. It's about a toothache. One of the girls, she says, frowning slightly, hasn't eaten in 2 days. She says it's nothing, but her face is warm. Infection, maybe. You offer to fetch the herb woman from the next village, but Hilda shakes her head. We have what we need. She just needs someone to notice. And here's your historical fact: medicine in the early medieval period was often passed down through women, especially in monastic settings. Hilda's abbey likely had its own infirmary, its own collection of herbals and healing recipes, some Christianized, some remnants of older pagan traditions. Monastic women were caretakers, yes, but also scientists in their own right, studying the body through observation, not theory. The quirky detail: some Anglo-Saxon remedies involved things like writing prayers on strips of linen and tying them around the afflicted limb. Others included burying a piece of bread soaked in holy water near an anthill to draw out the illness. Absurd, yes, but wrapped in real care. They healed with what they had: ritual prayer herbs and hope. The scholarly debate: were these women healers actually respected by the wider church, or were their medical skills quietly tolerated until a man could be credited with the same knowledge in Latin? Some argue Hilda's success protected her healers from criticism. Others think she was just very good at hiding what needed hiding. Back in the candlelit corridor, Hilda veers into a side room, the infirmary. The girl is there, face pale, one cheek flushed red with swelling. She tries to sit up when Hilda enters, but Hilda only waves her back gently. No scolding, no fear. She sits beside her and hums, just a soft melody, then pulls a small pouch from her belt, a mash of plantain and honey wrapped in linen. Old remedy, she says, not from a book. You sit beside her watching. There's no grand miracle, no sudden recovery, just touch, breath, warmth. The kind of medicine that doesn't fit into scripture, but still saves. Later, you find yourself in the Abbey's scriptorium, where the younger girls are copying texts onto vellum with ink made from oak galls and soot. One of them is writing not Latin, but Old English verse. It's a prayer, yes, but a rhythmic one. It sounds familiar. Sedman's poem, she says, smiling. She's learning it. Hilda enters then and sees the page. Make sure it's sung, not just read, she says. Poems live longer in the mouth than in the margins. Another truth. You step outside needing air. The sea wind hits you hard, cold, salty, reminding you just how remote this place is. But that's what makes it powerful. Whitby doesn't just echo with hymns. It hums with questions, with choices, with possibility. A rider arrives. Just then, his horse lathered his cloak, wind whipped. He carries a sealed scroll. Hilda opens it without flourish. Another king. Another request. She reads it once, then twice. Her brow furrows. He wants to move a boundary, she says, to take land from one family and give it to another. claims it's a reward. You ask her what she'll say. She doesn't answer right away. Instead, she asks a novice to bring a map, a rough one inked by candlelight, showing rivers and ridgelines, not borders. She traces a finger along the line in question. There's a stream here, she murmurs. It's dry most of the year, but floods in spring. The land isn't his to give. And just like that, she decides. Tomorrow, she'll write back, firm, polite, but clear. The king will listen, maybe even fume. But he'll listen, because Hilda doesn't just speak with authority, she speaks with knowledge. And more importantly, with fairness. In a world where borders are drawn by blood, she draws them with reason. You sleep that night in the upper dormitory under a woolen blanket that smells faintly of beeswax and lavender. Below, someone walks the halls, likely Hilda, checking windows, tucking stray rushes back into place, tending to the abbey as if it were a sleeping child. You dream of songs written in barns, of prayers stitched into cloth, of a woman who teaches not by command, but by quiet example. And when you wake, the abbey bells are already ringing. The girl with the toothache is sitting up, sipping broth. Sedman is writing a new verse. And Hilda is in the courtyard, hands in the soil, planting something that won't bloom until spring. But that's the kind of faith she keeps. Faith that roots take hold, that pain passes, that wisdom, once spoken, will ripple further than anyone expects. And that even in a cold stone abbey on a cliff, no one remembers how to find women's voices still matter. You step outside into the morning wind, and for the first time in a long while, it doesn't feel so cold. The wind hasn't let up since dawn. It rattles the wooden shutters and hisses through the cracks in the walls like a whispered warning. But Hilda, of course, pays it no mind. She's already outside, hood pulled low, checking on the thatched roof of the guest house and making sure no tiles have come loose from the chapel. You watch her from the refectory window as she climbs a ladder with the ease of someone half her age, fixing what needs fixing, always ahead of the complaint. By mid-morning, a new group of visitors arrives. Monks from a southern abbey, faces pinched from travel robes damp at the hems. They bow too deeply, speak too formally, and seem unsure of whether to address her as Mother Lady or something else entirely. She waves all that away with a smile. Just Hilda, she says, but they're not just here to exchange greetings. They carry a message, an invitation, no more than that, a summons. The king wants a council, a synod, to settle a growing problem in the church. The calendar. Yes, the calendar. And here's your historical fact. In the 7th century, there was a major disagreement in the English church about how to calculate the date of Easter. The Roman tradition and the Celtic tradition used different lunar tables, which meant Christians in the same kingdom could be celebrating Easter a week apart awkward, especially if a king celebrated Easter Sunday while his queen was still fasting for Lent. The King Oswiu of Northumbria wants unity. So he's calling the Synod of Whitby. And he wants it held here, at Hilda's Abbey, not at a great cathedral, not at a royal court, but here on a cliff edge where seagulls outnumber soldiers. And so the Abbey prepares, the quirky detail. The debates weren't just theological, they were political and oddly domestic. Queen Eanfled and King Oswiu themselves followed different Easter calculations. For years, the royal couple had kept separate observances, eating different meals in the same palace, depending on whose Easter it was. It's a bit like two spouses celebrating different New Years, and arguing about when to take down the decorations. The scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the synod was more about consolidating royal power than resolving religious disputes. Oswiu wanted a unified church because it made for a more governable kingdom. Others believed the theological stakes were real about discipline, identity, and loyalty to either Rome or Iona. But in either case, it's telling that he chose Hilda to host it because she represents more than either side. She represents trust. You help prepare the Great Hall. Not that it's very grand, just a wide room with rushes on the floor and a beam of light cutting through the high window. But it's enough. Benches are set. Food is simple, but warm, and scrolls are laid out along one table. Roman calendars, Irish calendars, lunar cycles, margins filled with scribbles from generations of monks trying to make the moon behave. They arrive slowly. Bishop Wilfrid Young, and sharp with a Roman tongue and a confident gait. Then Coleman of Lindisfarne, older wary draped in Celtic pride. Their followers fill the hall with clashing accents, competing robes, and 100 different ideas of what holiness looks like. And at the center sits Hilda. She doesn't speak first. She rarely does. She listens. For hours, Wilfrid makes his case. Rome is the heart of the church. Peter held the keys. The Pope's calendar must prevail. Easter must align with the global church. Coleman responds with the legacy of St. Columba, the strength of Iona, the tradition of the Celtic saints who brought light to this land long before Rome took notice. They go back and forth, charting moons and quoting saints, their voices rising and falling like tides. At one point, a monk slams his fist against the table. Another mutters a prayer under his breath, not for peace, but for victory. And all the while, Hilda says nothing, until night falls. Then finally she clears her throat, and the room quiets, not out of fear, but respect. She doesn't tell them who is right. She simply says, the question is not whose table is older, but whose feast brings more unity. Silence. Then she looks at King Oswiu, who has been brooding in the corner, trying to follow the argument and keep his crown on straight. He stands, declares his allegiance to Rome, and the decision is made. The Roman date will be followed. The synod ends. And just like that, centuries of tradition are folded up like worn linen, tucked into chests, and replaced by new ways. Some monks leave angry. Others stay uncertain. Hilda accepts the decision, but she mourns what's been lost too. Later, as the others sleep, you find her in the chapel, alone. She doesn't pray. Not allowed anyway. She just sits, hands resting on her lap, eyes closed. You ask if she regrets hosting it here. No, she says. Someone had to open the door. Then she looks at you, and there's a tiredness there, not of body, but of spirit. Do you know? She says we've been measuring time by stones and sun for so long we forget that the soul doesn't care what day Easter falls on. You nod, unsure what to say. Let them count moons, she whispers. I'll count the women I've helped stand. And with that, she rises, places a hand on your shoulder, and leaves. That night, as wind whips against the abbey walls, you dream not of calendars or kings, but of women walking long roads in the dark, finding their way to a light on the cliff. You wake before the bells. The fire is still warm. The hall is still. But something feels changed, not broken, just quieter. The morning after the synod is unusually still. No clamor of arguments, no cloaks flapping in haste. The abbey feels like it's holding its breath. You step into the garden and find the dew, untouch the herbs, damp and fragrant. with the kind of silence that only follows thunder. Inside, Hilda is tending to the fire as if the most consequential church council of her era hadn't just unfolded in her dining hall. She moves with calm hands, turning kindling as if it's sacred. And to her it probably is. After all, when kingdoms clash and bishops bark, it's the warmth of a shared flame that keeps people from freezing. Today's task is simpler, but no less monumental healing. Not bodies, though there are always bruises from long travel and rough roads. Today, Hilda turns her energy toward the emotional kind. The monks who stayed behind sit in corners brooding. Some feel defeated, others merely adrift. Their way of timekeeping of truth-telling was gently set aside. And while they've agreed to stay, their hearts haven't followed yet. Your historical fact for tonight, Hilda didn't just host the Synod of Whitby. After it, she remained a spiritual leader to both sides. Even those who opposed the Roman calendar sought her advice. She had a rare kind of authority, the kind that didn't need a crown or even a title. It lived in the way she listened. One of the younger Celtic monks, a pale, quiet lad from the Western Islands, approaches Hilda while she's mashing herbs. Will the abbey still keep the old prayers, he asks, voice tight. Hilda looks up. Only the ones that still feed the soul. But what about the Psalter of Columba? The chants. If they carry light, we'll keep them, she says. If they carry pride, we'll let them go. The monk blinks, not sure whether to feel comforted or corrected. Probably both. Here's your quirky detail. After the synod, there was a brief flurry of confused Easters. Some outlying villages still followed the Celtic dates for years afterward. There are records of clergy having to explain to entire congregations why their Lent had suddenly been shortened or worse extended. You can almost imagine the exasperated peasants. We were promised eggs today, Father, and the scholarly debate. It's about leadership. Some argue that Hilda's deference to royal and Roman authority was a form of political survival. Others believe it was spiritual clarity, that she genuinely believed the decision would unify the faith. The truth, as ever, might sit quietly between both theories, like Hilda herself on her wooden bench. In the following weeks, Hilda's Abbey becomes a place of unusual traffic. Not just monks and scribes, but women. So many women. They arrive in pairs, or alone in silence or tears. They come with nothing but calloused hands and questions. They've heard by rumor, by song, that there is a woman who speaks like a priest and listens like a mother. Some call her a prophet. Others call her dangerous. You help sort them. Some need food. Some need shelter. Some just someone to say, you are not mad for seeing visions. Others come because their husbands called them heretics, or because they once dared to speak scripture aloud and were punished for it. And Hilda welcomes them all. There's a woman from Dira, with a baby strapped to her back, who asks if it's true that Hilda never married. Hilda nods. Did you want to? A pause. No. But weren't you lonely? Another pause. Loneliness isn't cured by marriage, she replies, then adds softly, though some try it. That night, a storm comes in off the sea. You sit with Hilda near the hearth as she teaches a group of these women to write their names. Not Latin prayers, just their names. She starts with hers, Hilda. One slow letter at a time. One woman, wrinkled and skeptical, squints at the parchment. And what good will this do me? You'll know you were here, Hilda answers. The fire pops. The storm rattles the eaves. But inside, it is warm, and filled with the quiet sound of quills scratching. You start noticing small changes. The abbey garden begins to include plants not found in monkish manuals: wild sorrel healing, comfrey, moonwort. One woman brings seeds from her village, wrapped in linen and hope. Another adds a line of prayer to the psalms she chants at dawn. You think of it as a soft rebellion, and then just when peace feels settled, a visitor arrives with a scroll stamped in wax and worry. The king again. This time, it's not about calendars. He wants Hilda's opinion on a matter of succession. 2 noble sons, both claiming the right to a throne recently vacated by illness and accident. It's a delicate thing, kingship, and it seems absurd that one of the most powerful rulers in the land would ask the advice of a woman who owns nothing but a coastal abbey and a kettle full of nettle tea. But he does, and she answers. Not by choosing a side. Hilda writes a letter, careful-wise, maddeningly neutral, that advises the king to choose the boy who makes more room for others. When you ask her what that means, she smiles faintly. A king who listens is rarer than a sword without rust. You sit back thinking of all the weapons you've seen in your time. None of them have aged gracefully. It's hard to explain, but you feel something shift that day. The abbey has always been stone and salt and scripture, but now it hums with something else. Like the cliffs are echoing a name not out of fear, but in reverence. And that name is Hilda. That night, as you walk past the dormitory, you hear laughter, high, soft, unexpected. A group of women are weaving, yes, weaving by candlelight. They're not supposed to be awake, but one of them made a joke about St. Peter's fish being too small to feed 12 men, and the room erupted. You pause at the door, listening. It is not irreverent. It is joy. You think maybe Hilda knew that this too was sacred. Not only the chants and fasts and prayers, but the sound of women unafraid to laugh in the dark. Before you sleep, you find her one last time. She's in the chapel again, this time lighting a single candle. What now, you ask? She doesn't look at you. Now she whispers, we listen. To who she turns her face, haloed by the small flame. To the quiet ones. They're always the first to carry truth. And somehow, you believe her. The frost arrives quietly one morning, draping the abbey's fields in a thin silver veil. The air tastes sharper now, like it's been clarified by the chill. The cows breathe mist. The hens seem confused. Even the stones feel colder beneath your soles, as if the land is bracing itself for something unseen. Inside the scriptorium, a monk sneezes into a sleeve, breaking the silence. Ink blots the edge of a parchment he's been illuminating with careful reverence. It's a bestiary full of lions that look like dogs and dragons that look like worried lizards. You're helping him mix colors when Hilda walks in her breath, visible her cloak lined with rabbit fur. She doesn't greet anyone. She's holding a small pouch tied with blue cord, and she heads straight for the storage cell. That's the thing about Hilda. She's warm, yes. But when she's focused, the warmth fades behind her like candlelight in wind. You follow, of course. Inside, she kneels, opens the pouch, and begins counting silver pieces. Carefully, slowly. You count 12 before she speaks. We're feeding a village, she says simply. You blink. Which one does it matter? This is your historical fact. For the night, Hilda's influence extended far beyond the abbey's walls. She maintained relationships with kings, bishops, and chieftains, but also with peasants, herdsmen, and poor fishermen whose names were never written down. There are stories, small, quiet ones, of how she sent grain to starving hamlets and negotiated peace between feuding families. But here's the quirky detail. It wasn't always food or gold she sent. Sometimes it was riddles, actual riddles. Hilda had a fondness for wordplay, and she believed that sometimes giving someone a riddle to solve was better than giving them an answer. It stirred the soul, she said, and a stirred soul can feed itself longer than a full belly. You remember this as you watch her hand over the silver to a stable boy named Edric, no older than 12, with a pony and the world's biggest mittens. He nods solemnly, takes the pouch, and trots off like he's been entrusted with the crown jewels. Later that afternoon, a visitor arrives with an unusual request. He's tall, wrapped in fur, and carries a leather-bound book that looks older than half the abbey. He introduces himself not by name, but by affiliation. I serve the memory of Caedmon. And just like that, Hilda's eyes light up. You might remember Caedmon. He was the illiterate cowherd who legend says suddenly broke into divine song after a vision. Hilda took him in, encouraged his gift, and helped shape the first recorded English poetry in Christian Europe. Yes, that's your academic debate tonight, whether Caedmon really existed or whether his story was a convenient myth, a parable of divine grace bestowed upon the humble. Either way, his influence echoes. And now, here stands a man claiming to preserve that echo. He wants permission to transcribe some of Caedmon's verses into a new dialect, the Mercian tongue, so that more people might understand them. Hilda agrees instantly, but with one caveat. Include the part about fear, she says. The part where he was afraid to sing. The man tilts his head. Why that part? Because it's true, she says. And truth survives longer than poetry. The visitor bows. Later that night, the abbey fills with music, not chant, but humming. Wordless melodies, like echoes of Caedmon's first night. Hilda listens from her chair by the fire wrapped in a wool blanket, the color of dusk. I miss him, she says quietly. You sit beside her, and for once, you don't ask questions. You just listen. The season turns harsher. Snow arrives. The abbey becomes a hive of quiet resilience. Women patch cloaks with old linen. Boys carve spoons and carry wood. The sheep grow icicles in their wool. And then, because history never rests, a message arrives on a frozen morning, sealed in wax and dripping with urgency. It's from a monastery in the south. A young abbess, barely 20, has fallen ill. Her community is in disarray. The monks are unsure how to lead without her. They're requesting advice, or more bluntly, send someone like you. Hilda reads the letter 3 times, lips pressed. That evening, she takes a long walk across the cliff path. You follow boots crunching through ice. The sea is a sheet of slate, below waves, moving like breath beneath a winter quilt. She doesn't need someone like me, Hilda murmurs. She needs to become someone like her. You don't understand at first, but by dawn it makes sense. Hilda sends not herself, but 3 women from the abbey, each chosen for a different trait. One is a healer. One, a quiet listener. The third, a scribe who has never once misspelled the word for mercy. You're sending them alone, you ask. Hilda nods, with prayers and their own minds. And here's where the truth slips in, like sunlight through frost. The abbey is no longer just a place. It's a pattern, a method, a way of seeing the world where leadership doesn't roar, it whispers, where wisdom doesn't command, it invites. and that pattern is now stitched into people who will carry it far beyond these stone walls. Later that week, you find a letter tucked beneath your blanket. It's in Hilda's hand, and it reads, "If ever you wonder whether your presence here mattered, remember this. The fire is still burning, even when you are not the one tending it. You fold it gently, tucking it into your robe." One last note before sleep takes you. There's a rumor never confirmed that Hilda used to leave bread out for a fox. Just one fox. Every few nights, it would appear near the woods, and she'd place a crust on a rock. Not to tame it, just to acknowledge it. No creature, she once said, should feel forgotten. And perhaps that's her greatest legacy of all. Not the kings she advised, nor the synods she hosted, but the forgotten ones she remembered. The ones history rarely writes about. Like you. The days grow shorter now. Candles flicker earlier, and the evening prayer creeps closer to afternoon. Even the sea seems to sigh differently, slower, more deliberate, as if it knows that winter is tightening its grip. You've learned to read the rhythms of the Abbey the way others read Scripture. You can tell the difference between the bell for Vespers and the bell for news. So when it rings clear, single sharp, you're already halfway to the gate. The messenger is young, barely 17, with cheeks flushed raw and eyes that dart like a frightened bird. He carries a scroll sealed with an unfamiliar mark. When Hilda sees it, she doesn't break it open right away. She thanks him, feeds him warm broth, and lets him rest. Only after the boy's breathing steadies does she crack the seal and read, and frowns. You don't ask, not immediately. With Hilda, questions ripen slowly. Later by the hearth, she sets the scroll down and says softly, "They want a prophecy." You blink. "Who does?" "A nobleman. North of here. His wife is expecting. They've had 3 stillbirths. He wants to know if this one will live." You wait. She doesn't continue. "He thinks you're a seer." You ask, cautious. Hilda doesn't laugh. "He thinks I'm something between a nun and a crow. You've seen this before, haven't you? The way people confuse wisdom for magic. The way they treat intelligence as something spooky when it belongs to a woman. You remember an old wife in a nearby village who once predicted rain just by sniffing the moss. They called her a witch. She called it common sense. This tonight is your historical fact. In the early medieval church, women like Hilda often straddled an uneasy line between saint and sorceress. Officially, Christian doctrine denied all forms of divination, but unofficially, kings and bishops still turned to holy women when no priest could offer comfort, especially when the problem was something earthly, bloody, female. And here's your quirky detail. Some nobles believed that abbesses like Hilda could hear the unborn speak. Not in words, but in dreams, in omens, in odd movements of the moon or birds. One record even mentions a baby that fluttered at the sound of a psalm, and thus was deemed blessed. So you're not surprised when 3 nights later, Hilda has a dream. You're by her side when she wakes. "There were geese," she says. You raise an eyebrow. "Is that a good sign?" She rubs her eyes. "Only if they fly south." She pens a letter, chooses her words carefully, and sends it off without revealing what she saw. You sneak a peek before it's sealed. Let the child come as the snow comes, without fear or invitation. You never find out what happened to that nobleman's wife. That's the thing about Hilda. She plants meaning like herbs and trusts it will grow elsewhere, even if she doesn't see the harvest. Now it's your turn to be summoned. One of the younger novices has fallen sick. Not gravely, but enough to worry the others. You bring her boiled wine and lavender water, tuck her in, and sit quietly until her fever passes. While she dozes, she asks you something in a thin, drowsy voice. Is it true Hilda once cursed a bishop? You smile. No, she corrected him. The difference you tell her is important. Hilda never raised her voice in public. She never flung curses or clutched relics like weapons. But when a certain bishop once preached that women should remain silent as the tomb, she rose from her seat, not with anger, but with calm, and said, "Then the tomb has already spoken." For Christ rose, and it was a woman who carried the news. The abbey had gone still as frost. Here's your academic debate tonight, whether Hilda was a proto-feminist or simply a pragmatist shaped by necessity. Did she truly believe in the equality of women, or was she simply using the authority she had to serve her people? Scholars disagree. Letters are cited, parchments unfold, but in the quiet of the abbey, you've learned something simpler. Sometimes power whispers, and sometimes that whisper shifts the world. You're reminded of this when a merchant caravan arrives from the south, bringing wool, ink, and gossip. Among the goods is a small vial of blue pigment, lapis lazuli, ground into powder, rarer than gold. The scribe gasps. The novices gather around. Hilda picks it up, turns it in the light, and says, "We'll use this for Mary's robe." You ask her why. Because she deserves to be seen in heaven's own blue. A few nights later, you find her painting the Virgin's sleeve by candlelight. It glows almost unnaturally, even in shadow. She looks up and says, "They'll remember this color, long after they forget my name." And here's the thing, she's not wrong. In centuries to come, pilgrims will stare at this page in some dusty archive, marveling at the blue, wondering about the hand that placed it there. They won't know her face, but they'll feel her. And isn't that what she's always done? Not demand to be remembered, but to make things that linger. It's nearing the solstice now. The year curls inward like a sleeping cat. The fire burns low. You and Hilda sit in silence, the kind that doesn't ask for conversation. Just the crackle of wood, the hush of snow falling beyond the window. Finally, she says, "Do you know why I chose you?" You don't answer. Not because you're afraid, but because you're not sure there's a right one. She continues, "Because you listen, and because you let others speak." Then she smiles, not with her lips, but with her eyes, the way snow gleams when it remembers the sun. And suddenly, you understand. This place, this abbey, these people, it was never about cloisters or chants. It was about teaching silence to sing, about giving voice to those told they had none. You glance at the blue pigment. It glows in the dark, and so do you. The frost settles into everything now, into the folds of your sleeves, into the stone floor, into the rhythm of your thoughts. You've stopped hoping for warmth. Instead, you've learned to befriend the cold, to let it sit beside you like a quiet guest. In the abbey, everyone walks a little slower, speaks a little softer, and leans in closer to the fire. Even Hilda wears 2 layers now, and when she lifts her hands in blessing, you catch the faint crackle of wool beneath her sleeves. Tonight, you are called to the scriptorium. You expect a task, perhaps scraping parchment, or grinding ink, or sorting through a crate of mouse-nibbled scrolls. But when you enter, Hilda is already there seated with her back to the hearth. She doesn't speak at first, just gestures toward the corner where a small, weather-warped box rests beside a stack of unwritten vellum. Inside the box bones, tiny, fragile bones carefully wrapped in linen. They found her under the nave, Hilda says quietly. a girl, no older than 12. You say nothing. The silence feels sacred. She was buried with a scallop shell, Hilda adds. Perhaps they hoped it would count as a pilgrimage, a common medieval practice. If you couldn't afford to walk the holy roads, you might be buried with a token from someone who did. It was a spiritual loophole, one last attempt to get through the pearly gates. And scallop shells, those symbols of St. James, were carried like passports of faith. But this girl had no name, no cross, just the shell and the dirt. Write her something, Hilda says, voice low. Let her have a story. And so you do. You sit down, dip your quill in ink, dark as winter, and begin. You don't know her name, but you give her a voice. You don't know her fate, but you give her a journey, one with streams and starlight, with soft bread and warm hands. You write until your fingers ache. And when you're done, Hilda takes the page and tucks it beside the bones. She's remembered now, she says. Here's your historical fact. Medieval abbeys were often built atop older burial sites. As foundations were laid, or chapels expanded, bones would surface, nameless, forgotten, quietly waiting. The church rarely halted construction for the anonymous, but some abbesses, like Hilda, found small ways to remember them. A line of verse, a painted flower, a tucked-away page, and tonight's strange but true detail. There were monks who specialized in naming the unnamed. They would cast lots or read random pages of scripture and assign a saint's name to the bones, hoping it would guide the soul through purgatory. One friar reportedly named 27 skeletons after variations of Thomas because he happened to be reading the same gospel over and over. But Hilda doesn't choose a name. She chooses a story. You leave the scriptorium, and the cold greets you like an old friend. The moon hangs low over the cliff, casting the sea in pewter and pearl. There's no wind tonight, just a stillness that feels almost too heavy for words. At dawn, a messenger arrives again, this time from Lindisfarne. He brings troubling news. The local lords are feuding over a relic. One claims to own a fragment of St. Oswald's finger. Another insists he has the true nail from the true cross. The towns are squabbling. A church has been burned. Pilgrims are turning away. The bishop writes, "Send help," or "Send Hilda." You look to her expecting reluctance, but she's already packing. A flask of wine, a pouch of herbs, 2 loaves wrapped in linen. No grandeur, no procession, just a staff and a sense of purpose. You're going alone, you ask. She shakes her head. No, you're coming. And just like that, you're on the road again. This time, not as a novice, not as a servant, but as a companion. The journey is short, but the cold makes it feel endless. You pass bare fields where sheep huddle like stones. Cross bridges that groan under frost. Sleep in barns and chapels in one inn where the straw bites like nettles and the porridge tastes of ash. When you arrive, the feud has only grown worse. The relics are displayed like trophies. One in a golden box, another in a carved oak chest. The lords glare across the churchyard like children guarding toys. Their wives whisper behind sleeves. The townsfolk, weary and divided, mutter about curses and signs. A woman swears her cow has stopped giving milk since the finger arrived. A baker says his bread won't rise near the nail. And here's your academic debate. Were relics truly sources of unity or tools of political power? Some scholars argue they brought communities together through shared faith. Others suggest they served as medieval PR. Whoever had the best relic got the most pilgrims, the most donations, the most prestige. Hilda doesn't argue. She listens. For a full day, she says nothing, walks the town, blesses the sick, eats with the poorest family she can find. And then, on the second night, she calls both lords to the chapel. They expect a sermon. She gives them silence, just the sound of fire crackling of the sea outside of their own breathing. Then gently, she tells a story, not of relics, but of a girl once buried beneath a nave, remembered only by a shell and a line of ink. She didn't need a finger bone, Hilda says. She needed mercy, and we gave it. The room goes quiet. She doesn't mention politics. She doesn't threaten or flatter. She just says softly, if you want holiness, stop counting bones. Start feeding the hungry. You see something shift in their faces. Not shame exactly, but recognition. The way dawn light touches a wall and makes you notice the cracks you never saw. They don't burn their relics, but they stop parading them. And in the weeks that follow, the pilgrims return, not for miracles, but for bread and beds and peace. Back at the Abbey, winter deepens, but somehow it feels warmer. The walls hold more stories. The pages of your scrolls no longer feel empty. You begin to write not just what happened, but what it meant. And Hilda, she paints. Quietly, with sure strokes, she fills the margins of her manuscripts with wildflowers. Violets, thistles, tiny curling ferns. She says they remind her of those who bloom unseen. And you realize that's what she's been doing all along. Not seeking power, not building legacy, but making sure the forgotten are no longer invisible. And maybe, just maybe, you'll do the same. The snow arrives like a whisper, first in the corners of windowsills, then curling softly over the stone garden walls. It doesn't announce itself with storm or drama. Just a quiet, steady fall that turns every edge of the Abbey world into something softer, quieter, and strangely timeless. Inside the walls, life does not stop. The novices still rise before dawn, still sweep the cloisters, still mumble psalms with sleep-thick tongues. But something about winter slows even time. You start counting days, not by calendar or feast, but by small things. How low the oil burns in the lamp, how early the birds go silent, how long it takes the hearth to stop smoking in the morning. Hilda does not change. Not really, but she settles. Her stride is slower, her voice lower, her gaze longer. And when the bishop writes again, she does not leave. She sends words instead of feet, advice instead of presence. She says, the land needs stillness now. And you, strange thought, you agree, because it's in this stillness that something begins to grow. You begin to teach, just once at first. A nervous young girl, barely 12 shy as a moth, asks you how to hold the stylus without smudging the ink. You show her. She smiles. That would have been the end of it, but Hilda sees. Of course she does. The next day, there are 3 more girls, then 5, then a boy who's too clumsy for farming, but has a gift for patterns and letters. And just like that, you're leading what the Abbey now calls the night school. It's unofficial naturally. No curriculum, no formality, just parchment candlelight and the slow, thrilling magic of watching someone else's mind open like a window. Here's your historical fact. Whitby Abbey, under Hilda's leadership, became one of the most respected centers of learning in early medieval Britain. Not just for monks, but for women, for children, for those considered unteachable by others. Kings sent their sons here. So did fishermen. And here's the odd detail. One of Hilda's protégés was a cowherd. His name was Caedmon. He couldn't read, couldn't sing, couldn't write a single word. But he had dreams, strange, vivid ones, in which angels gave him songs. One night, he woke with a verse on his lips, and Hilda listened. She didn't scoff. She encouraged him. And from that moment on, the illiterate cowherd became England's first named poet. His verses were copied, memorized, cherished. It makes you wonder how many verses were lost because no one thought to listen. And so you listen. You listen to the girl who writes in crooked Latin but uses verbs like tiny firecrackers. To the boy who hums while he traces illuminated letters and dreams of illustrating saints with bird wings. To the girl who tells you in the dark that she sometimes thinks God is in the silence more than the sound. You don't correct her. You nod. Because sometimes silence is holy. One evening, you find Hilda in the garden, though the snow comes up to her calves. She's planting something tiny black seeds in a patch of churned soil. You can't help but laugh. Nothing will grow there now, you say. She smiles. Not now, but later. And there it is again, her unwavering faith in time and patience in things unseen. Later that night, during the long psalm, the Abbey's dogs begin to bark. Not once, not twice. A low, sustained warning. Then comes the knock. Not at the gate, but the side postern, a door rarely used, meant only for quiet entrances or those needing help. Hilda sends you to open it. What you find is not what you expect. A woman, barefoot, her cloak stiff with frost, holding something wrapped in wool. A baby. Her eyes are wide with something beyond fear, exhaustion maybe, or disbelief that she made it this far. She does not speak Latin, barely any English either. Her accent is thick with the North Sea. You can piece together enough to know she fled from a lord's house. She was, how did she say it, offered to a knight, then discarded when her belly swelled. You don't need to know the details. You already know the story, and you already know what Hilda will do. She doesn't ask for proof, doesn't question the baby's paternity or the woman's past. She simply wraps her in blankets, feeds her broth, and gives her a bed in the herb room where it always stays warm. And here comes your academic debate. Did medieval abbeys serve as sanctuaries out of religious duty or quiet rebellion? Some historians suggest it was a legal obligation under sanctuary law, protecting fugitives for 40 days. Others argue abbacies like Hilda used their authority to shelter women because no one else would. A practical mercy in a brutal world. A loophole of compassion. You watch Hilda that night, watching the baby sleep. You've done this before you whisper. She nods. Many times. How many have you saved? She shrugs. Enough to know it matters. That night, you cannot sleep. You wonder how many other women walked toward this abbey in the snow. How many were turned away from places less merciful? How many never made it? The question doesn't keep you awake in fear. It just holds you gently, a kind of weight that reminds you you're part of something much older than yourself. In the days that follow, the baby thrives. The mother begins helping in the kitchen, then in the garden. Hilda never asks her to stay, but she does. Eventually, she learns the rhythm of the bells, learns to hum psalms while sorting lentils. One day, you find her drawing letters in the dirt with a stick. You kneel beside her, help her shape a vowel, then another voice rescued, another mind reclaimed. One night, just as the moon reaches its highest, Hilda asks you to walk the wall with her. The sea is black and endless, but above it, the stars blaze in patterns no human hand could draw. She points. There, she says, is the shepherd. You know the constellation. But her next words surprise you. And that one, she adds, will name for her. For who? For the girl you wrote about. The one with the scallop shell. Let her have a star. You smile. There's nothing official about it. No astronomer will chart it. No king will decree it. But in your sky, she shines. And for now, that's enough. The thaw begins not with warmth, but with noise. A drip. Then another. Then a rush. Icicles fall like glass chimes from the eaves, and the snow that once cloaked every path with silence now melts into the muddy chorus of returning life. The abbey roof groans, the cloister puddles, and inside everything smells faintly of wet stone and old wool. But with the thaw comes something else, travelers. Letters arrive folded with seals you recognize, and some you do not. There are scrolls from York, messages from distant monasteries, even one ragged missive sealed with beeswax that smells suspiciously of smoked eel. Hilda reads each one with the same serene frown. And then one morning she tells you they've called a synod. You blink. You know the word, but not the weight of it. A gathering, she explains, of churchmen, of kings, of questions. She says it gently, but you can feel the current under her words. A decision is coming, and she must go. Here's your historical fact. In 664 AD, the Synod of Whitby was convened to settle a seemingly simple question: should the Northumbrian Church follow the Roman Christian calendar or the Celtic one? But under that lay deeper tensions about authority culture and whose version of faith would shape England. And here's your quirky side note. The disagreement centered around the date of Easter. One faction celebrated with a lunar-based Celtic cycle, another with the Roman reckoning. Sometimes you'd have one group feasting while the others were still fasting awkward, especially in a shared court. Even more awkward when a queen and king observed opposite calendars. Hilda is not the kind of woman who likes being wrong, but she is the kind who knows when it's time to listen. The debate will not be held far. In fact, it's to be held right here in the very place she built. Kings, bishops, monks, all will gather at Whitby Abbey, and it will fall on Hilda to host them. Not as a footnote, not as an afterthought, but as a central figure. And here is your academic debate. Was Hilda truly in favor of the Roman decision, or did she quietly dissent while outwardly accepting it? Some sources, like Bede, paint her as obedient to the outcome. Others suggest that her heart remained with Celtic tradition. Her actions, her advice, her mentorship, they all bore the soft, persistent marks of the old ways. And you're not sent away during the synod. You're kept close, because Hilda knows that you, like her, are learning how power moves. The abbey transforms. Tables are set. Beds are arranged. Clean tunics are borrowed from trunks sealed with wax and prayer. Even the bees are disturbed to provide honey for honored guests. The scriptorium is swept for once. The herb room is turned into a council chamber. Then the guests arrive, some on horseback, others in palanquins. A few arrive with such entourages, it seems the entire countryside must now be empty. And among them, Wilfred. He's younger than you imagined, sharp-featured, robed in Roman fashion, with the smooth confidence of someone who's never been told no. He greets Hilda with formality and kisses her ring. But his eyes scan the abbey like a land surveyor, measuring what might be changed. He does not greet you, not at first. You are invisible again, until you're not. Because during the long hours of the synod, when debate circles like a falcon refusing to land, Hilda calls for silence. And then with no parchment, no notes, she stands and speaks. You have never seen men in armor, men with mitres, men with scepters go so still so quickly. She speaks of unity, of peace, of not splitting the young church with pride or memory. She praises the old ways, but points toward the need for a common path. She names names softly but clearly until even the most Roman among them fidgets, and then she sits. The silence that follows is not hesitation. It is awe. It's Wilfrid who stands after her. He argues as expected for Rome, for Peter's authority, for order, for obedience. His voice is sharp, trained, unwavering. But it's not his words that win the synod. It's the moment King Oswiu declares with theatrical simplicity that he would not risk offending the doorkeeper of heaven. If Peter holds the keys, then Peter's calendar shall prevail. And just like that, it is done. Rome wins. You wait for Hilda to protest. She does not. She only nods and says nothing. But later that night, you find her in the courtyard facing the sea. She does not speak, but you notice something. She is humming a Celtic hymn, not loud, not in rebellion, just remembering. You say, you could have changed his mind. She smiles. No, I could have made him doubt. That is not the same. The guests leave in the days that follow. But not all. Some stay. They ask to learn, to study, to copy books. Even Wilfrid, after a time, sends a request for manuscripts. Hilda responds, of course, but you can't help but notice the script she sends is half Celtic in style, just enough to be noticed, just enough to be overlooked. It is her quiet rebellion. Yours comes later. One of the young scribes you've been teaching, a girl with a lazy eye but impeccable memory, asks if she can copy a psalm. Not just read it, not just learn it, copy it. Her fingers tremble, but her lines are steady. You praise her gently. Then you tuck the page into the shelf with the others. She is the first of many, and one day, when you're older, it will be her script that teaches someone else. A cascade of invisible teachers, none of whom ever sat on a throne, but all of whom shaped kings. You begin to see what Hilda sees. That power isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears wool and speaks softly and holds a baby while singing verses no bishop has yet approved. And sometimes it's a woman who never calls herself powerful, just faithful, just firm, just endlessly, maddeningly, quietly correct. The years roll in like mist from the sea, quiet, persistent, and a little colder than you remember. Hilda's hair is silver now, though she still walks the cloisters with the same measured pace, as though each footfall places something holy into the ground. The abbey no longer feels new. The stones have softened under the hands of 100 pilgrims. Even the sea seems less wild now, as if it too has settled into the rhythm of monastic life. You notice that visitors no longer come just for books or blessings. They come for Hilda. They come to listen. One morning, a young man arrives at the gate with a face like carved walnut and a tunic stiff from road dust. He carries no recommendation, no scroll, only a look of quiet desperation. You're about to turn him away when Hilda appears behind you and says, "Let him in." His name is Kedman, and he cannot sing. That's not a metaphor. It's his actual problem. He works with animals, low work, stable work, but he says that when the harp is passed around at feasts and others sing songs of scripture, he always leaves, quietly, ashamed. His throat dries. His mind goes blank. He knows the stories. He just cannot speak them. So Hilda, does the most unexpected thing. She asks him to sleep. Not work, not study, just sleep in the guest cell. And that night, according to the legend that will later shimmer through history, Caedmon dreams. In that dream, a man stands before him and says, "Sing me the beginning of all things." And Caedmon, who had never sung a line in his life, does. When he wakes, he remembers every word. You listen as he recites it to Hilda the next morning, nervous, low, half-whispered, and you see her eyes light up, not with surprise, but with recognition. Because here is another truth, one history often skips. The first named English poet is not a king or bishop. He's a shy, illiterate cowherd. And his first poem, not a tale of war or conquest, but of creation. Here's your historical fact. Caedmon is the earliest named English language poet whose work survives. His hymn was written in Old English, and though he likely could not read or write, his verses were passed orally until scribes recorded them, most famously in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And your quirky side note: the rhythm of Caedmon's hymn mimics older Germanic battle poetry, short punchy half-lines separated by a pause. Yet it praises not warriors, but God as a builder, a shaper of the heavens. Imagine starting your national literature with construction metaphors. It's charming, really. Now, for the scholarly debate, did Caedmon's story unfold exactly as Bede told it? Or was his tale shaped by monastic scribes who wanted to sanctify the origins of English poetry? Some argue Caedmon's name became a vessel, a symbol for humble inspiration. Others say the dream was real, and Hilda, ever the weaver of human threads, knew it before the rest. But what matters is this Caedmon stays, and you teach him. Not letters, he'll never quite master them, but form, shape, rhythm. You help him structure verses, and you listen patiently as he stumbles through lines. He apologizes every time. Hilda never lets him stop. He hears what others do not. She says, once watching him scratch shapes in the dust with a stick. You wonder what she hears in him, and then you see it. In the way, novices now begin their day, not with a Latin chant, but with one of Caedmon's simple hymns. In the way his words pass from mouth to mouth over bread and barley ale, until even the children hum them without knowing their source. He has become something sacred, not because he meant to, but because someone gave him a place to speak, and that you think is the greatest miracle of all. Later, as the days grow shorter and the nights more bone deep, you notice Hilda tiring more easily. She sits longer by the fire. She speaks less, but smiles more. She tells you once, while mending a sleeve, "I used to think power came from certainty, from always knowing. But now, I think it comes from letting others speak, even when you're afraid they'll say the wrong thing." You nod, not trusting yourself to speak, because you've started to notice what she's doing. She's handing things over, quietly, gradually. She lets you lead prayers now. You're the one who walks new visitors around. You notice she listens more than she corrects. And one night, when a young girl from the fishing village comes with a sick baby, it's you who mixes the herbs. You who rocks the child. You who tells the mother what to expect by morning. Hilda just watches. Not with pride exactly, but with peace. The Abbey has changed, not just in stone and scripture, but in purpose. Where once it was built to house monks, it now shapes voices. Writers, women, cowherds, scribes, quiet men, and determined girls. It becomes what Hilda has always been, a place where stories start, and that's when it hits you. kings listened to Hilda because she listened first, because she made space, because she never shouted, but you remembered everything she said. And because her kind of power doesn't pass with age. It lingers. In people like Caedmon, in people like you, and perhaps in the girl now copying verses by candlelight across the scriptorium, unaware that centuries later, someone will read her work and wonder who taught her. You smile, because you know. And because you were there when a king listened to a woman named Hilda. The sea is quieter now. Or maybe you've simply grown used to its voice, less a roar, more a breathing presence, steady and familiar. The abbey too breathes. Each wall, each window pane of translucent horn, each set of calloused hands lifting morning bread, all of it part of a rhythm Hilda helped set in motion. And you move within it like a verse in one of Caedmon's hymns, small necessary humming just beneath notice. But tonight, there's a stillness. Hilda hasn't risen for lauds. You wait longer than usual, folding linens just to busy your hands, but she doesn't come. Not to prayers, not to the garden, not even to her favorite stool by the fire. When you finally go to her cell, the door creaks with a sound that feels too loud. She's there, sitting upright as always, eyes closed as though listening. A book lies across her lap, open unread. Her fingers rest on the page. You don't cry. Not then. You sit beside her, take her hand, and whisper the hymn Caedmon once sang by heart. Just the first few lines. The ones she always loved best. And when you finish, you close the book. She never wanted marble. No relics. No holy bones to be fought over by bishops with quills. She asked to be buried beneath the cliffs, where wind could sing over her, and seabirds could write her elegy in the sky. The funeral is simple. Peasant women carry herbs. Monks sing plainchant. Caedmon weeps openly his tears, falling on the hem of a tunic Hilda once patched. A young girl from the scriptorium recites verses she'd written in secret trembling until you take her hand. No one speaks of sainthood, but everyone feels it. Here's your historical fact. Hilda of Whitby died in 680 AD after leading several religious communities across decades of war plague and power struggles. Bede, the medieval historian, claimed she was so beloved that even distant abbeys saw visions of her passing bells ringing on their own lights appearing over the sea. Now, for the strange little detail, Hilda suffered from a lingering illness for 6 years before her death. But she kept leading prayers, advising rulers, and mentoring poets without pause. According to lore, she delivered her final sermon the very night she died. Imagine clocking out of sainthood duty just hours before passing. Now that's commitment and the scholarly debate. Some argue Hilda's portrayal in Bede's text was shaped to elevate the authority of the Church of Rome, especially during ongoing disputes about whether to follow Celtic or Roman practices. Was she a unifying figure or a narrative device for theological convenience? Others argue Hilda wielded very real influence, balancing diplomacy, education, and spiritual leadership in an era that rarely allowed women to do any one of those things, let alone all three. But for you, none of that matters now, because you're standing where the abbey meets the edge of the world, scattering petals across the grave of the woman who changed your life with nothing but a question, a quiet invitation, and a lot of listening. After her passing, there's a sense of drift, not collapse. Hilda was too careful for that, but a softness at the seams. Some monks go back to Canterbury. One young scribe takes her chances in York, hoping to copy law codes. But the women stay. You stay. And gradually, something curious happens. The abbey becomes quieter, not empty, just gentler. It ceases to be a place of power and becomes something closer to what Hilda always saw in it, a school of wisdom, not in the loud sense, not with whips or scrolls thrown across lecterns. Wisdom of the hand, the eye, the pause before speaking. You teach now. You never planned to. But the questions keep coming to you in corridors, in kitchens under the moonlight when someone can't sleep. What do I do when my voice shakes? What if the others think I don't belong here? What if God is silent and you find yourself answering the way Hilda did? With more questions, with gentle pauses, with time. One evening, years later, a messenger from the south arrives. Dusty hurried asking for Hilda. You tell him she's passed. He bows his head and offers a wrapped parcel. Inside is a manuscript. It's old now. The ink faded the vellum dry, but unmistakably Caedmon's. You smile. Tucked inside is a note. For the abbess who taught me to dream, and for whoever teaches after her. There's nothing grand about the words. No wax seals. Just gratitude. And hope. So you shelve it next to Hilda's own copy of the Gospels, the one she translated herself, with small marginal notes that always made you laugh. Things like "this sentence is clumsy," or "the boy dropped ink here," or "remind the cook to stop burning the barley." You preserve those scribbles. You teach the novices to read them aloud, because they are her voice. Because power doesn't always sit on thrones. Sometimes it sits on straw beds, with ink-stained fingers, reminding you to laugh, even when the wind howls. The abbey ages with you. The stones grow softer, the gardens fuller, the shelves thicker with poetry and prayer. Visitors still come less for guidance, more for pilgrimage. They want to see the place where kings once knelt to hear a woman speak. You let them look, but you don't explain too much. Hilda would have hated a tour guide. Instead, you let them wander. Let them find her in the shape of a letter, in the cadence of a hymn in the moss that grows in the cracks she never wanted sealed. Sometimes you sit by her grave. You tell her what's changed, who's learning what, who cried at breakfast. You think she hears you, or maybe you just hope she does. Either way, it feels right. And as you watch the sea darken under a bruised dusk sky, you think we remember her, not because she shouted, but because she listened and taught us all to do the same. The seasons keep circling quietly. The sea winds never stop their songs, and the sun, in its measured patience, glints on the abbey rooftops, just the way it always did, when Hilda stood among the herbs, sleeves rolled up correcting a bishop's Latin while shooing away a goat. You wonder sometimes, what would she think of this world now? It's been years. More than you care to count. The girls you once called novices now guide others with hands as steady as your own once were. They speak softly, not from weakness, but because they've learned that still voices reach furthest in the long run. You taught them that. Or rather, she did through you. The abbey has become something different. Less a fortress of learning and more a hearth. Less about controlling ideas and more about keeping warmth alive. People come not just for theology, but for comfort. Not for authority, but for kindness. And though Rome still sends its messengers, and the kings, their clerics, they stay fewer nights, speak a little gentler, and bow their heads when they pass her grave. That's the funny thing about power. Real power doesn't bark orders or stamp documents. It doesn't demand silence. It listens. It waits. It invites. And if it's anything like Hilda, it smells faintly of rosemary and salt air, and it makes a better stew than sermon. Here's a fact you might like: the Synod of Whitby, that grand debate over whether England would follow Roman or Celtic Christian customs, was held under Hilda's roof in 664 AD. She didn't get the outcome she wanted, her favored Celtic tradition lost, but it was she who hosted the council. Kings, abbots, priests, and monks gathered not in a palace or fortress, but in a woman's abbey, because they trusted her judgment and her fairness. Now for the quirky bit. Some historians believe the meeting was so heated that the Irish delegates refused to eat at the same table as their Roman counterparts. Imagine that spiritual unity debated over an awkward mealtime where nobody touched the boiled leeks. And the debate. Well, some scholars argue the synod was less about religion and more about politics. Aligning with Rome meant aligning with Europe's growing ecclesiastical power and distancing from the Irish monastic networks that had quietly shaped northern England. Did Hilda support Celtic practices because she believed in them? Or was she standing for local tradition against the rising tide of empire? The truth, as always, sits somewhere between parchment lines. But here's what you know. When the council ended, when the men with scepters and scrolls went home, it was Hilda who stayed. Hilda, who comforted the losing side, who reminded the monks that Rome might win doctrinal battles, but kindness still ruled the heart. She didn't leave. She never left. And neither did you. One morning, you wake before dawn, long before the rest. The abbey sleeps still and folded like a hand in prayer. You light a candle, just like she did, and trace the script on a new vellum page. Your fingers are slower now, but steadier. The ink follows your breath, and a new story begins. Not a gospel this time. Not a psalm. Just a memory of Hilda and a girl and a goat in the kitchen garden arguing over whether turnips count as edible or merely medicinal. You smile. The script flows. Later that day, a child finds you there. Her name is Ida. She's new, barely old enough to reach the top shelf, but already full of questions. She asks you how to copy letters like that. You invite her to sit. Show her the loop of the G, the sweep of the S, the way you press lightly on the E. She messes it up, of course. Blots ink. Sighs loudly. Then tries again. You let her, because that's how it starts. The next day, she brings a friend. Then another. And without meaning, to the scriptorium becomes a classroom. A lively, laughing, inky mess of a classroom. You never meant to lead again, but you do. And every now and then, as you teach them how to trace, how to listen, how to pause before answering, you hear her, in the back of your mind, smiling probably, muttering something like, "I told you you'd end up here." You tell stories too, the kind she told you, about Cadman the poet who couldn't read, about the girl who cured fever with hot vinegar and song, about the crow that stole an entire communion wafer and wouldn't give it back for 3 days. And you tell them about the synod, how a woman once sat at the center of history, not shouting, not ruling, just holding space for people to speak. You don't say she was a saint. They'll come to that on their own. You say she was a woman who made things grow faithwards, people. One afternoon, Ida asks if she can write a prayer for Hilda. You say yes. She comes back with a crumpled bit of parchment and reads it shyly. It's not elegant. It's messy, full of odd phrasing, and a drawing of what might be a whale. But it ends with, "Thank you for showing the world that women can teach kings, and also make good bread. You don't correct her, you hang it on the wall. Because frankly, that might be the best epitaph anyone's ever written. And that's how the Abbey goes on. Not in stone, not in rules, not in relics, but in pages passed from hand to hand, in questions whispered in candlelight, in stew stirred, while discussing theology, in laughter during scripture lessons. They come and go, these girls. Some stay forever. Some leave to become abbesses or poets or mothers or travelers. But they all carry a little of her, a little of you. And as you sit by the window in the evening, watching the sun sink behind the cliffs, you realize this was never about rule or fame or winning synods. It was about listening, letting the sea speak, letting the silence hold you, letting wisdom take root in places no one expected it to grow. The Abbey isn't famous anymore. The scrolls don't mention you. Even Hilda, in the grand histories, becomes a few paragraphs. But here, in these walls, in these hearts, she's everything. And you're part of her echo, the kind that never quite fades. The fog rolls in gently, from the sea silvering the fields and softening the stone lines of the Abbey's cloisters. It always starts this way, this particular morning, quiet, cool, and with a kind of expectant hush in the air, as if even the gulls are waiting for something to happen. You've grown used to this pattern. You know the tides of the weather, like you know the folds in your linen. But today feels different. There's a kind of memory in the mist. It takes you a while to notice the silence isn't just peaceful, it's sacred, as if the whole world is holding its breath. A little like the day they buried her. You remember it clearly. Not just the tears or the chants, but the odd quiet afterward when everyone left and the Abbey breathed her name into the walls without speaking. They buried her on the headland just where the cliffs fall away and the sea hums its low lullaby. They said kings sent offerings that bishops wept, but what stayed with you was the girl barefoot with smudged ink on her fingers who laid a single violet on the stone and whispered, "Thank you." There's power in that kind of goodbye. You've spent years since then, not building monuments, but weaving her story into lives. It was never about canonization for you, not about relics or miracles. It was about the way she moved through the world, gently, with full sleeves and firm eyes, always listening first and speaking last. People still come to ask about her, pilgrims mostly. Some wear sandals, some arrive with scrolls full of questions. But a few come with nothing at all, just tired eyes and a hope they can't name. You don't give them sermons. You show them the kitchen garden, still full of leeks and lavender. You let them sit in the scriptorium and touch the parchment. And sometimes you let them read the prayers the children have written for her. There's one that says, "Help me be like her, but also like myself." That one's your favorite. And here's a curious detail. One you haven't told many. You still have her comb. It's small, carved from bone, worn smooth at the teeth. Nothing fancy. But she used it every morning, even when the wind was strong enough to tip a bishop off a hill. She'd sit calmly, drawing it through her hair, then tuck it into her belt like a sword. You keep it wrapped in cloth in the bottom of your chest. You don't need relics, you tell yourself. But still, you keep it. Because history isn't always the grand gestures. Sometimes it's a comb, a cooking pot, a crooked line of handwriting in the margin of a prayer. Sometimes it's the memory of laughter during Lent, or the way she used to hum under her breath when reciting psalms. And here's where the story begins to circle back on itself. Because now, they ask about you too. Not often, not formally, but sometimes a girl will say, "Who taught Hilda's stories to you?" Or, "Where did this song come from?" Or even, "Did you know her?" And you smile. Because the answer is yes, and no, and yes again in the ways that matter. One of the oldest girls you think she's ready to teach soon brings you a scroll she's been working on. It's titled The Quiet Rule of St. Hilda. She asks if she can read it to you. You nod. She writes about wisdom, passed like embroidery thread, about leadership that kneels before it speaks, about how strength and silence are not opposites, but sisters. It's beautiful. A little flowery, perhaps, but she's young and hopeful. You remember when you were the same. She asks if she's got it right. You don't correct her, because she's got it exactly right. That night, you light a candle and walk slowly, now slower than before, out to the headland. The wind is soft. The grass bows low. You sit beside the stone that marks her name. It's simple. No gold, no carving. Just her name, and beneath it, a line that reads, "She opened the mind and kept the hearth." You close your eyes. The sea speaks again. It always does in the end. And you listen, because you've learned that the best stories aren't shouted. They're whispered. They're lived. And sometimes they wear wool cloaks and carry soup and teach little girls how to hold a quill. Here's your last historical note fitting, really. Bede the chronicler, who recorded so much of early English Christianity, wrote about Hilda with respect that crossed theological lines. Roman and Celtic monk and priest all seem to agree she was a woman worth listening to. Now some modern scholars debate whether Bede embellished her legacy to fit his own model of holiness. Did he write her as more serene, less stubborn? Did he sand down her edges to fit the shape of sainthood? Perhaps, perhaps not. But here's the thing. You've always believed legends are truths, even when they aren't facts. And if people still whisper her name on foggy mornings, if girls still learn her songs and write her prayers and comb their hair thinking of hers, then she's not gone. Not really. You sit a while longer until the candle goes out. Then slowly you rise. You tuck your cloak close and you walk back through the dark, back home. The candle is out, the sea is quiet, and the night has folded itself gently around your shoulders. You've walked through the cloisters, sat in the garden, where the mint still grows wild, and followed the worn path out to the headland, where memory lingers like morning mist. And now, at the end of it all, there is only stillness. This is the part of the story where the page turns itself. You've heard the name Hilda whispered through centuries of echoing stone. You've stood where she once stood, felt the wind that tangled her veil, and listened to the same seagulls that cried above her roof. But most of all, you've traced her shape not in statues or stained glass, but in everyday things. The way wisdom moves through kitchens, how silence teaches better than noise, how a woman with patience and purpose can shift kings' counsels and the very course of history. You've seen how a soft voice carries further than a shout when it knows where it's going. And now you carry a little of that story with you. Maybe tonight, when your head touches the pillow, you'll remember something small, an herb she grew a child. She taught a choice she made that rippled through time like light on water. Maybe you'll think of how strong gentleness can be. So let the hush of history settle over you. Let the quiet strength of Hilda guide you into dreams where cloisters bloom, candles never go out, and wisdom wears the face of someone kind. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.